And I'm only going to use 3 short verses tonight. Though short in words, powerful, I think, in message. You know, these words that we're going to read as our primary text in a few minutes tonight are often overlooked because they are in between 2 passages that are very well known. In Ephesians chapter 4 and in the latter part of Ephesians chapter 5. And very well studied passages, but these I think are very important to us, as is often the case in the Bible. Brief verses often say a lot, and we need to hear what God is saying to us because we are, by anybody's standard, living in very difficult times. The worldwide pandemic has caused problems not just with health, but with economies of our country and the world, and with trust. There is a basic mistrust. I could line up 10 people tonight on the front row, and I could possibly get 10 different versions or beliefs about the pandemic. It is, and very vocal ones, very verbal ones. People believe what they believe very strongly. And it's not just the pandemic and the damage that it has done, as well as hundreds of thousands of lives around the world. It's also people who, a year ago tonight, had reasonable prospects for their futures. They worked hard. Maybe they were in the restaurant industry. Maybe they were in retail. Maybe they were in the service industry. And they've worked hard all their life and maybe tried to build a business. And in 9 months' time, it is gone. Gone. And not only that, but outside of Florida, for the most part, people don't see each other hardly at all. I can't tell you how many stories in our church or in my community of winter folks who come back down and say it's so glad to be somewhere where you can at least go somewhere and make your own judgment about where you can go or what you can do. In most places in our country, you can't even make that judgment. And so people have been locked in quarantine for so long, I don't think we're ever going to know for sure the cost in depression and anxiety and suicide and alcoholism and drug abuse and other issues associated with the pandemic. And then it hasn't just been the pandemic. There's been the wild swing in racial tensions dating back to May and first the George Floyd incident and then several others. And then on top of the racial violence and instance, there's been cities looted and burned. My next door neighbor is a winter resident from Michigan, but they just flew for Christmas out to Portland to visit their children and grandchildren and spend the holiday there. And listening to him yesterday tell me about what they went through just as travelers in Portland, and just this past week, was sort of unbelievable. And then on top of all that, we had the most dramatic and divisive election in decades, maybe ever, on top of all the other things I've already discussed. And what has happened is there's this tension that is very real. It's not imaginary. It's serious. Add to that the trends that have been happening for 2 or 3 decades now of Christians being lowered, their number being lowered in our country. And there's no question that is happening. And so I asked a friend of mine who is a professional counselor and a psychologist, what he's hearing in his office, and he said the problem is not just the health and economic crisis. There's something much deeper going on in the psyche of our country. There's a pervasive sense of anxiety, as if just about everybody feels like they're walking on thin ice. And you have to be more careful what you say. And then he said something I found very interesting. He said, things look like they have changed and may not come back. Gun sales are up enormously. People are amassing cash and gold. People are starting to grow their own food. Church attendance is down, way down. Some churches still aren't even meeting. In fact, I think the majority of churches still aren't even meeting. But where they are meeting, church attendance is way down. It was already down before the pandemic. On top of that, people have lost faith in their government. They feel they have been lied to on both sides of the aisle. The pervasive cynicism about our government leaders definitely crosses party lines on both sides. And so my counselor friend said what he thinks he is seeing is a psychological pandemic that is more dangerous than the COVID pandemic as to the future of things, of our country, maybe even of mankind. He said something I found very interesting. He said, there has always been a pill for this or a therapy for that. But he's not sure there's a pill or a therapy for a change in mood that creates such anger and fear and anxiety and division and mistrust. And that's something for us to seriously think about as Christians. So what do we say about all that? Well, first, I kind of agree with that analysis of our current national mood. It's hard to be optimistic when the business you've spent your life building has collapsed out from under you. It's hard to be optimistic when you have had serious health issues, or somebody you know or somebody you love has had serious health. We have one family in our church that has lost 4 people in their extended family to COVID. And it's hard to be optimistic when you seem to be getting hit from every side. But here's what else I believe as a student of history and as a student of the Bible. I believe that times like these often occur at hinge moments of history where God is working in ways that we can't understand. He's moving in mysterious ways, as we sometimes used to sing. And we don't see it or understand it at the time, but it may be happening. Now, we know there are hinge moments in history. We spent the fall talking about that with God's covenants. But not only his covenants, throughout history, there have been time periods where we see the hand of God later. We didn't see it at the time. We see it later. And so we know that God has moved in these ways at times in the past. And I just wonder that maybe God is suddenly rearranging the pieces on the board, faith speaking. And perhaps we are sort of, have you ever seen a high-flying act and people are between trapezes and you sort of get a little nervous about it because you don't see how is their hand really going to reach the next one? And it sort of feels like we're in one of those periods where we're in a high-flying act and we're in between. We've left one and we're heading to the other one, but we're not quite there yet. And maybe that's where we are as a country. And we don't feel like for sure there's a net underneath. And we don't have any kind of crystal ball to predict what's going to happen 6 weeks from now, or 6 months from now, or a year from now, or 10 years from now. So I think our text tonight offers some generalized help for Christians when they feel this way, because when Paul wrote these words, he had to be feeling that way too. I'll explain why in a few minutes. But I think this text helps us get started with the idea of what Christians do when we feel outnumbered, when we feel like we're in a minority, and when we feel like a lot of bad things are happening around us. We face a strange situation in the world today, a seeming contradiction. Things are getting worse, have been getting worse for the last year, which means these are great opportunities for the people of God. What it means is, if we'll look at it this way and take it this way, it's an opportunity for us to reach out to some people we could never reach out to, and people who might be willing to listen, who might never have been willing to listen when things were normal. It often takes the abnormal to get people to listen to solutions or to the truth. So my question for you tonight, before we begin the text and as we sort of begin this series, is should we be optimist faith-wise, or should we be pessimist faith? I know a lot of people who are pessimist faith-wise. I know a lot of people who say Christianity is on the decline in America. It's not ever coming back. We've seen this throughout history. I know a lot of people who say that. Should we be optimist? Should we be pessimist? Should we be somewhere in between? Well, Paul, who you would have thought would have been a pessimist at this time, says some interesting things to us. And the first thing he says is be very careful in these kinds of times just how you live. So in the NLT it reads, so be very careful how you live. Don't live like fools, but like those who are wise. And that is great advice for us right now as Christians on the verge of 2021. Be very careful how we live before unbelievers. You may destroy the opportunity of an unbeliever to become a believer by being pessimistic and faithless during a time when people need hope. People never need hope more than during a time of hopelessness. And so that's why Paul says to these Christians in the church at Ephesus, be very careful how you live in a time like this. Don't live like fools. Live like people who are wise. But I grew up preaching in the King James Version. And so I went back and looked at it because I thought I remembered the word that was used there, and I did. See then that ye walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. Now, honestly, as I was studying, preparing this lesson, it's the first time I'd heard that word circumspectly in years. That's just not a word that we use anymore. So I looked it up. It has the idea, and carried with the idea of people in the first century who would have read this passage, has the idea of walking on a narrow path along the side of a steep mountain. Keep your eyes wide open in case you lose your step and maybe fall to your death. That would have been the literal meaning of this word to the readers in the first century. Circumspectly. Sometimes we're guilty of not living circumspectly. We live in the moment. We live too fast. We make too many snap judgments, too many hasty decisions. We speak too fast. We speak before we're thinking. We move too fast. We reset too fast. We answer sometimes before we even hear the question. We're more interested in saying something than listening or hearing something. We just keep pressing the throttle forward because we've got so much on our plate and there's so much to do. And he says, slow down and be very careful how you live. There may be people at your work, in your community, in your family right now who are not Christians and who are watching you to see how you handle what's going on in 2020. I think about that a lot of weeks when I walk up here. There may be people in the auditorium. We have visitors every week. And there may be people in the auditorium who they're looking for answers, not problems. They already got the problems. They're looking for faith, not faithlessness. They already have the faithlessness. They're looking for hope, not hopelessness. They already got that. And so Paul says to these people, be careful how you live. Be circumspect. In one sense, the answer lies in that great Psalm 46:10 that says, be still and know that I am God. This is not a time for Christians to forge forward not knowing what the future holds. This is a time to see if God is in one of those hinge moments in history where he's arranging the pieces differently. And we need to let him be God. Be still and know that I am God. And we don't need to act like we've got all the answers. I don't have them anyway. But we don't need to act like we've got all the answers. And we know all the truths about the pandemic, about COVID, about the economy, about politics, about the race relations. It's awfully hard to put your feet in somebody else's shoes. And this may be a time where we need to be more careful than ever how we live, so that we make sure we slow down enough to let God be involved. And when we do that, I think we discover he can do far more than we could ever do on our own. And then he said a second thing. He said, make the most of every opportunity that you have in a time like this. Now watch this. Make the most of every opportunity in these evil days. What kind of days was Paul addressing when he wrote this? Well, first of all, he was in prison when he wrote it. So he wasn't having a good day any day, physically speaking. And the prisons then were like the prisons today. So he said, these are evil times. These are extraordinarily evil times, but make the most of every opportunity in these evil times. Once again, my mind wandered back to the King James Version, which I began preaching and using, where it says, the King James Version says, redeeming the time. Redeeming the time. What does that mean? Well, to redeem is a salvation word, but originally in the first century it came from the marketplace. If you redeemed something, it meant you bought it back. You purchased it. You redeem something when you buy it for your own use. That's why we say Christ is our Redeemer. He bought and purchased us with his own blood for his use, to be his servants, to be a part of his family. So Paul says here, redeem the time. And you'll note that both the NIV and the NLT say, make the most of every opportunity. Both words use the word, both passages use the word opportunity. That's because the Greek language has two basic words for time. One refers to the passage of time in the sense that we talk about hours and minutes and seconds. We will say, well, we're going to leave at 7:30, so it's 7:12 right now. So that means you need to be ready in 18 minutes. The passage of time. That's one sort of time. But the other Greek word, and that's the one that Paul uses here, refers not to the passage of time, but to the moment of opportunity that requires action. It's the Greek word kairos, K-A-I-R-O-S. And it refers to the moment of action. You get a moment of opportunity, but it's not there always. It's not every second like the passage of time. There is a time when you have an opportunity and a time when you don't. And so as I was thinking about that, I thought about the speech Martin Luther King made to a vast crowd gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in the National Mall in August of 1963. when he was in the biggest fight of his life for the civil rights movement, and actually had just gotten out of jail a few days before this, having been arrested. And he said this: "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now." What a brilliant use of language. The fierce urgency of now. Paul said, redeem the time in these evil days. Make the most of every opportunity in these evil days. Realize we are right now in America in the fierce urgency of now. With what seems to be the decline of faith in Christianity on one end, and then one crisis after another piled on top of it. And check that little phrase at the end of verse 16, because the days are evil. The days are evil. Here's another translation. These are desperate times. In fact, I decided to look this up in a paraphrase, the Message. It says, watch your step, use your head, make the most of every chance you get. These are desperate times. Don't live carelessly, unthinkingly. Make sure you understand what the Master wants. So like any passage, as I've told you a million times before, you can't just pull passages out and make them say what you want them to say. Any passage means what it means, says what it says in the context in which it was written. So what's the context in which this was written? Where he says, redeem the time, make the most of every opportunity in these days of evil. Well, Paul writes these words while he's chained to guards in a Roman jail. The emperor was a man by the name of Nero, a perverted excuse for a king if there ever was. There's nobody ever been any more wicked than Nero. So if you think we are living in evil times, they weren't as bad as when Paul wrote these very words. Not even close. Before too long, Nero is going to set fire to Rome and blame the Christians. And so persecution is going to break out against the Christians like nothing you've ever seen. Later, he would order Paul beheaded. Ephesus was a city that was the most important city in the Roman Empire in the province of Asia. It was a coastal town full of all kinds of wickedness. The Temple of Diana, that's what the Romans called it. In Ephesus, they called it the Temple of Artemis, was there. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But it basically was a monument to paganism and to any kind of sexuality. Artemis was the goddess of sex. Her temple contained a statue of a woman with many breasts, symbolizing uncontrolled sexual freedom, which is what was going on in Ephesus. We in the 21st century have nothing on first century Ephesus when Paul wrote these words. In fact, one of the commentaries I read concerning the Ephesians said, their morals were lower than the animals. They were heavily into astrology, black magic, sorcery, every kind of sexual perversion, every form of idolatry imaginable. And meanwhile, on top of that, the Christians were having to deal with that on one side, and yet, because Nero's going to burn Rome down and blame the Christians were about to have persecution roll in on them like the waves of a hurricane. So they got it coming from all sides. They got it coming at them from all sides, the first century Christians do. Sometimes we think that today, and we do to some degree, but nothing like they had. That's what makes this text so valuable and important right now to us. in the fierce urgency of now. This text is so important to us because the times were at least similar in which these words were written. And what did he say to them? Be careful how you live. Be wise, not foolish. Unbelievers are watching you. Make the most of every opportunity and redeem the time because the days are evil. And that's what Paul meant when he said, these are desperate times. What would he say today? I think he would say something very similar. Because evil times, evil days, tempt us to despair, cause us to want to give up, cause us to want to say we can't do it. The day is dark. People don't believe the Bible anymore. They don't believe Christians anymore. They think we're kooky. There's nothing that can be done. I, for one, refuse to believe that. So the first thing I want to say in this series is, I don't think God is through. I don't think it helps us to think that God is through. Because throughout history, and particularly throughout Bible history, the things that make it difficult for us to live as Christians are also the very things that make us shine as Christians. Here's what I believe. I believe Christianity and Christian faith has declined because we've been comfortable and spoiled, not because we've been persecuted and mistreated. I don't think we really know what persecution and mistreatment is. I think we like to say that. We don't know anything like what they were experiencing in first century Ephesus. For goodness sakes, Paul wrote these words in prison for preaching the gospel. And yet, the church grew by leaps and bounds after the persecution. It's not that God is not at work or God won't work. See, hard times can be blessings in disguise. Days of moral compromise offer incredible opportunities for the gospel because people are desperate and they are searching for something that is real, true, and lasting. I think we've seen that in the last few years with what has happened, for instance, in the abortion movement and the right to life movement. You do understand that in the 70s and 80s and 90s, more than half the country believed abortion was the right thing to do. And even as religious faith has supposedly declined, the belief in a right to life and a right for a baby to be born has risen. How do you explain that? Well, I think when we stand for things like we have stood for that and defended that position repeatedly, when we really stand for things and make an effort to stand up for Christ in a world that's in opposition, the message eventually starts to slowly get through. I think the problem is we haven't been standing. We've been easy to retreat. When the world around us seems to be going haywire, we have an incredible opportunity to shine. The darker the night, the more we can shine as Christians. And one last thing this text tells us. Keep doing what the Lord wants you to do. The last verse in this short text says, don't act thoughtlessly, but understand what the Lord wants you to do. So when I looked up that phrase that I thought I had remembered, the fierce urgency of now, in the August 1963 civil rights speech in Washington, there was a link to a speech that I hadn't watched in many years, the speech on the night before King's assassination in Memphis on April the 3rd, 1968. No, I'd seen it many times before. I decided I was going to watch it again, and I watched quite a bit of it because, quite frankly, from a speaker's standpoint, it's almost majestic in its content and language and flow. And I guess I had forgotten that if you read it in its context or listen to it in its context, it's a remarkably hopeful message given the evil days and the pressure of those times. Because we know what happened the next day, we tend to focus on just one line of that. I don't know what's going to happen, in the future. And we, looking back, do know what happened. And because we focus on that, I think we tend to miss the optimistic tone in it. So I watched the whole thing. And though you can sense the unrelenting pressure of opposition and death threats, there underneath it is a bedrock faith that God controls the world. And he frames the whole message this way. He says, suppose God were to come up to him and ask this question: Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in? And he goes on to survey all of human history, starting with Egypt and going on to Greece and to Rome, and then skipping the centuries of the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation on to the days of Abraham Lincoln, and then on right up to those very troubled days in 1968, when the whole fabric of the nation seemed like it was about to unravel. I remember it well. And here is his imagined answer to God's imagined question: what age would you like to live in? He said, strangely enough, I would turn to the Almighty and say, if you allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy. Now that's a strange statement to make, because the world was so messed up in 1968. I tell my kids all the time, you think it's bad in 2020, you should have lived in 1968. Seriously. The nation was unbelievably sick in a lot of different ways. People were dying. They were just dying in Vietnam instead of the coronavirus. And they didn't know why. Riots were everywhere. People were being shot on college campuses, at Kent State University, at South Carolina State University. It was just everywhere. So that was such a strange statement, but a statement of faith. If he were to ask me if I could live in any time, it'd be right now. And he goes on to talk about what it means to live in such a crucial moment of history as that was, and he applies the situation to the sanitation strike going on in Memphis. And as I read that, I thought, wow, that could be us right now. If God were to ask any of us, at what point in history would you most like to live? Well, I wonder how many of us would say the first month of 2021, because there's so much opportunity here, because when it's darkest, that's when Christ can shine the brightest. And then he spoke these words that everybody knows. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. My goodness. If you took the racial situation and the racial tension then and now out of the equation altogether, And you just read that. Maybe you were a Jewish man, so you considered Paul saying that. Maybe you're Caucasian, so you considered me saying that, or you. You just read those words. You're being threatened every day of your life, and the very next day you're going to be gunned down and murdered. And you say, I'm happy to be here right now. I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. I want to live a long life, but I'm not worried about that. And then, right in the middle of all that, and I guess I just never had seen it, or maybe I'd forgotten it, or maybe worse yet, I wasn't looking for it. Right in the middle of all that, I just want to do God's will. You got Paul sitting in a prison cell in Rome, writing to the church at Ephesus, be very careful how you live. Make the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Do God's will, be circumspect. You've got king going to die the next day just trying to work for people's civil rights, saying, I just want to do God's will. And we have Christians today saying, the sky's falling. I don't want to be identified with the people today who have so little faith in God that they are saying the sky's falling. I want to be identified with the people who, whether they're sitting in jail or they're living under death threats and going to be assassinated the next day, saying, I just want to do the right thing. Live right. Be careful how you live. People are watching you. I just want to do God's will. Those 7 words summarize how we ought to face the future. How grateful we should be for the privilege of being alive in such a time as this. Wherever God has placed us. Are there bad things happening? Yeah. Are there good things happening? Sure. Our church has reached more people in the last 9 months than we've ever reached in the history of our church. There are some weeks there have been 1,600 people watch our service online. And while online services have declined somewhat, we still had well over 400 watch this week. There are people watching this right now. There are opportunities for people all around us if we will open our eyes and see them. So people say, well, Randy, are you an optimist or a pessimist? Both, but mostly I'm an optimist because I know God is in control of the world. Governments are not. They think they are, but they're not. That has always been true throughout the Bible and throughout history. I know that God is in control of the circumstances of life. Sometimes the answer depends on where you are at the moment, where you are in those hinge moments I talked about a minute ago. It's kind of like being in Jerusalem when Jesus was crucified. Well, if you'd asked me on Friday as a follower of Jesus how I felt, I would have said I'm pessimistic. If you'd asked me on Saturday, I would have said I'm depressed. But if you'd asked me on Sunday, it would have been a whole different answer, right? And Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday. And I think that can be true of us today as believers. So yes, Christians are both pessimists and optimists, but I'm much more optimistic because I know that Jesus Christ wins ultimately. We win ultimately. He lives. And because He lives, we too will live. And like you, I wonder what the future holds in the short term, but I know what it holds in the long term. And that's what we got to keep in mind. And that's the king that will keep us hopeful and optimistic and walking carefully and circumspectly and doing God's will and making the most of every opportunity in these evil days. These are great days to be alive. Exciting days, amazing days, uncertain days, trying days, frightening days, anxious days, hopeful days, discouraging days, promising days, days of opportunity. All those things are true at the same time. It's not one or the other. They're all true at the same time. So I would remind you of Jesus' words to his own disciples who were feeling their own anxiety and were anxious in their heart because he had just told them he was going to be leaving them soon. And he sensed their fear and their troubled hearts, and he said, don't let your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. Or as Paul Harvey once said, in times like these, it helps to recall there have always been times like these. There have. And so no matter what happens tomorrow or next year, if 2021, God forbid, is even worse than 2020, God's promises still hold true. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has given me victory. This is my God, and I will praise him. My Father's God, and I will exalt him. So be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Don't panic. For the Lord your God will personally go ahead of you. He will neither fail you nor abandon you. No one is holy like the Lord. There's no one beside you. There's no rock like God. God is our refuge and strength, always ready to help in times of trouble. God has said, I will never fail you. I will never abandon you. You belong to God, my dear children. You've already won a victory over those people because the Spirit who lives in you is greater than the Spirit who lives in the world. What shall we say in response to all these things? What shall we say in response to what has happened in 2020? What shall we say in response to what might happen in 2021? If God is for us, who can be against us? That's what we should say. And so Sunday morning and over the coming Wednesday nights, I'm going to introduce to you more, like I said, this is the prologue. I'm going to introduce to you more the idea of what happens when believers are outnumbered. How do we react and how do we respond to that?